Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Content warning. The episode you're about to listen to covers a Nancy Drew original text story. These books were written from the 1930s to 1950s, a time that was culturally very different. Within some of these original stories, there are sometimes references to alcohol, smoking, and racist depictions. Listening discretion is advised. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of True Drew Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing the original text for the second Nancy Drew book, The Hidden Staircase. So this book, like The Secret of the Old Clock, came out in the year 1930, so there's a lot of differences in culture. I think we talked about this last episode. It's just a very different world, and there are a few problematic depictions in this book as well. I'm sure that not all the original texts are like that, but these books are nearly 100 years old. A lot has changed from 1930 to 2024. Also, really quick, I wanted to say I hope you guys had a Merry Christmas and you got to spend time with family and friends. I like to spend time with my family. We always get together on Christmas Eve, so that's really fun for me. So, The Hidden Staircase. We'll go ahead and jump into some of the characters that we see in this book. So, right off the bat, one of the key differences in the characters between the original text and the revised. In the revised text, we have Nathan Gomber, but in the original, his name is Nathan Gombet. I'm not really sure why they changed that last letter in his name. We still have the Turnbull sisters, which they're the ones we're trying to solve this mystery for, Rosemary and Floretta, but they're not Helen Corning's aunts, or if they are, it's not ever mentioned in this text. But Helen Corning isn't really even in this book hardly, and in the revised text, she plays a huge part in the book. There's also no strange person wearing a gorilla mask at the window like in the revised text. Since Helen's gone, we don't get that scene. We don't get the scene where she and Nancy dress up in like colonial party costumes that they find in the attic. So all that stuff was added on later, and I feel like we got a very different book since Helen Corning really isn't in this one. Now there's also one other character who she's just referred to as the maid. She has no name, but she works for Nathan Gombet, and this is the character that we see a lot of the racist depictions towards, so that's kind of unfortunate. So here's a brief synopsis to get us back into what The Hidden Staircase is about. Nancy Drew is checking in with her friends she helped on her last case, The Secret of the Old Clock, when Abigail Rowen introduces her to the Turnbull sisters, who think their house is haunted. Nancy sets out to help them and learns that Nathan Gombet is trying to bully more people than just her father into bad deals. So next, let's go ahead and jump into the direct quotes and notes that I took for the original text of The Hidden Staircase. So in the first few pages of this book, it opens up with Nancy reading a book and she's very bored, and she reasons with herself that she wants another mystery. She can't sit still for too long. And she also, there's this really cool scene where she's looking at the clock on the mantle and she references her past case, The Secret of the Old Clock. They do this in the revised text a lot too, where Nancy has a souvenir that she gets at the end of every mystery. But I like how in the original texts, they tie it in more naturally. It's not just like Nancy's last case, the crooked banister. It's more of a natural flow. Like Nancy is bored, she wants a new mystery, and naturally she's thinking about the last mystery that she solved. The next note that I have down, Nathan Gombet, and I so want to call him Nathan Gomber because in the revised text he spoke about himself in the third person a lot. It was really weird. But Nathan Gombet just makes himself at home and waltzes into the Drews' house, and I did not like this. Like he's a awful guy. You get that impression right off the bat. But I wouldn't have answered the door. I don't know why Nancy answered the door, because she's the only one there. And then I was like, well, maybe that's why I don't have any mysteries in my life, because I don't answer my front door. I also don't have jerks or weird people coming into my house, though, too, so that's a bonus. But I guess in Nancy's defense, she was bored. She answered the door. But Nathan Gombet basically accuses Carson of having swindled him out of a piece of property by the river. And we saw a little bit of this in the revised text. There's this railroad bridge that's, been put in, and a lot of people in the town are not happy about it in River Heights. But Nancy hotly defends her father, and she is like, my father would never do that to you. And basically what's happened, Nathan Gombet sold this parcel of land, and this railroad wanted to develop it, put the bridge in, and he's just mad because he didn't get more money for it. He just sold it really quickly, and he didn't ask for more, so that's nobody's fault but his own. So Nancy tells him, you'll have to come back when my dad is home. He's not home right now. But Nathan Gombet shoves his way into Carson's study, and Carson is away on business at the moment, and Hannah is off. She's not working that day. So Nancy's all alone with this pushy, violent man who is just going to go and start searching through Carson's desk. It's really scary. This is the part where I was like, Nancy, I wish you hadn't opened the door. But Nancy grabs the phone and threatens to call the police, and that eventually makes Nathan Gombet leave. Thank goodness, because the book spares no detail. He gets very violent and is shoving Nancy and is threatening her. It's just really scary because Nancy in the original text, she's only 16. So I did think it was interesting. We do get another description of Nancy in this book, and the book says she was an only child, but though she had been indulged, she had never been spoiled. She was an unusually pretty girl, fair of skin, with friendly blue eyes and golden curly hair. Her friends declared that she was as clever as she was attractive. I'm kind of curious to see when Nancy's Titian hair color comes in, if that was just in the revised books or if it comes into the later original texts. I don't know, but so far she's, described as just being blonde, which I had already known that. So one thing that I really like about the original texts is Nancy doesn't just drop the people from the previous mystery like hot potatoes. She still checks in on them and they come into the books, or at least they do in this book. That's kind of nice because, I don't know, it feels a little more realistic that way. Just because the mystery's solved, the people don't just go away. But Allie Horner, one of the people that Nancy helped in Secret of the Old Clock, comes to visit and brings Nancy a chicken that Hannah can cook and 24 eggs. And it also turns out that Allie knows of Nathan Gombet. So Nancy mentions that she had just had this really rude encounter with Nathan Gombet. And Allie says he used to buy eggs from her, but she told him to leave and never come back when he tried to steal an extra dozen. So this guy is just a horrible person to everyone that he encounters. But Allie also says that he's mad about a railroad bridge being built on property he sold, and he always thinks someone is trying to cheat him out of something. And there's even a rumor that he's threatened to bomb the bridge. Just a pleasant, all-around good guy. The next note that I took down, Allie actually has a roadster now, a lot like Nancy's, because, she came into all that money that Josiah Crowley gave her, which she never would have had if Nancy hadn't found that second will. But Nancy decides to ride halfway with her. Allie goes home and she drops Nancy off near the railroad bridge. And she walks back along the river and is looking at the bridge. And it's just kind of a cool scene because Nancy is, looking at this bridge and speculating, what if Nathan Gombet actually, acted on those threats and bombed this bridge? It could hurt a lot of people. I think another thing, just from the few books that I've read so far, that the originals do better than the revised. We actually get, ideas into what Nancy's thoughts are. In the revised, it's just more of Nancy did this, and sometimes she'll get upset about something, but in the original text, we get these deep scenes where Nancy voices her thoughts on things. So unfortunately, Nathan Gombet comes back because, of course, that's not the last we've seen of this horrible guy once Carson gets home, and Carson asks what he wants, and Nathan says Carson knows what he wants, and the lawyer responds with, what you want and what you may get are two entirely different matters. Oh, when I read that, I was like, I love Carson. He has some of the best comebacks in this book. He actually has another great comeback right here where, Nathan Gombet tries to say that the bridge damaged his property because he still has some adjoining property where he keeps, some animals or something. And Carson asks, well, how did it damage your property? And he says, the trains scare his horses. And when Carson asks how many horses he has, he says 1, and then Carson quips, "You have 1 horses?" Like, you can't have 1 horses, like that's plural. So this was so funny, and Nathan Gombet gets really mad at him. So it's after this that Nancy goes to check on Abigail Rowen, the elderly woman that was in The Secret of the Old Clock. Nancy went to visit her back in that book, and she had fallen, and Nancy helped her out, got her some groceries. But she's doing so much better. And see, this is what we don't get in the revised text of The Hidden Staircase. Like, I was wondering, like, what happens to Abigail Rowen? Like, she gets that money from Josiah Crowley, but, like, does her health improve? Does she have, like, a better life? We don't know. But in the original text, Nancy goes back to visit her, and she just so happens to be visiting with a friend who is Rosemary Turnbull. And this is how Nancy gets her next mystery. So there's just a really good tie-in there. We get to check in on these older characters, and then we get to meet these newer characters. So there's another mystery, and Rosemary Turnbull says she is plagued by a haunted house that she and her sister live in. So Abigail Rowen brings Nancy this mystery, not Helen, like in the revised. So the symptoms of this haunting are a lot like in the revised. There's not too much difference there. Rosemary says there have been weird sounds, shadows. There's been flies, which I don't think there were flies in the revised. That's kind of a weird detail. And there's a silver spoon and a pocketbook that went missing. So Nancy asks if anyone has been seen around, and Rosemary says just their caretaker and an organ grinder. So I knew what an organ grinder was because I've seen them in old movies or whatever, but basically it was this person that would go around, and I'm picturing like an accordion, but it's probably different from that. It's more of a cranking mechanism or something, but they would usually have like a little monkey with them. And so I thought it was hilarious because Nancy speculates, well, maybe the organ grinder's monkey got in the window to your house and climbed in and stole some things. So I'm just like trying to picture someone walking around with an accordion and a monkey now in River Heights. I mean, they did have that clam salesman guy in The Crumbling Wall, but it's just like, what a weird job. I don't ever have anyone interesting like that comes in my neighborhood. Like, nobody comes and sells clams or has a pet monkey. It's just always people trying to sell me AT&T. So this next note is another big key difference between the original and the revised text, but instead of Twin Elms, the Turnbull's house is just called The Mansion, which just sounds really generic, and, it's haunted, so the Haunted Mansion. But I actually like the name of Twin Elms better. It kind of accurately depicts, there's 2 houses because, of course, there's that neighboring house that looks just like their house. But yeah, I like Twin Elms way better than the mansion. We also kind of get more of a description of the house. Like, I think the Twin Elms houses were just kind of more colonial brick in style, but Nancy says that this house looks like a castle, and when Nancy and Rosemary go up to the house, Rosemary says they've been locking their door of late. Oh, those were the days when you could go away from your house and leave it unlocked, and you could come back and it would basically be exactly how you left it. So it's as Nancy and Rosemary are going up into the house, Rosemary's sister Floretta comes out, and she's all like a flutter, and she says, "My diamond bar pin is missing." And so Nancy asks when she last saw it, and Floretta says she had just been completing her toilet and then heard the Iceman at the back door. So that whole sentence is just full of like things that are just a sign of the times, like a diamond bar pin. Like, you might still hear of someone wearing like a diamond brooch or something, but she completed her toilet. Like, I'm assuming this is like her hygiene routine, her get ready with me, if you will. And then like just an Iceman. It's so weird to think about people bringing you a block of ice to keep your groceries cold. So Nancy and Rosemary can tell that Floretta is really upset. I mean, it's probably an heirloom piece and worth quite a pretty penny. So Nancy agrees to take on the mystery. So when Nancy gets back home, she's so excited that she blurts everything out about the haunted house that she thinks really isn't haunted. And Carson says that doesn't make any sense. And so he and Nancy go back and forth, and finally he agrees to let her help the sisters, because at first he kind of has some reservations. He's like, I don't know, that sounds kind of like something you shouldn't be involved in, Nancy. There's all these weird noises and things are getting stolen. Like, I don't want you to get hurt. But he ends the conversation by saying, I guess you're a born detective, Nancy. But okay, this next thing is crazy. If this isn't a sign of like how much things have changed since 1930, I don't know what is, but Carson gives Nancy his revolver. He gives a 16-year-old a gun. And I thought Nancy holding a gun in the original Secrets Can Kill game was intense, but wow. So Carson's like going on this trip to Chicago, and the book says Nancy doesn't tell Hannah of her plans, but I guess he's just wanting her to feel safe. I mean, he gives it to her as like insurance, like, hopefully you don't have to use this. But it's like, should a 16-year-old have a gun? I don't think they should. So I know I said that we don't really see Helen Corning in this book, and we really don't. She's briefly mentioned in the book, but Nancy goes to see Helen at this point, and she says next time Nancy has a mystery, she wants to come along. But the book says Nancy was on the verge of telling Helen about her new mystery, but Helen is a natural-born gossip. So basically, Helen Corning won't be solving any mysteries with Nancy anytime soon, or maybe she will, I don't know. Maybe she'll come up in the original texts at some point and they will solve a mystery together. But it sounds like Nancy's not very confident in her ability to keep her mouth shut. So the next note that I took down kind of has to do with Hannah Gruen. And the book just refers to Hannah as the housekeeper. And I said, this is so sad. And I talked about this last episode. But I miss the warmth of Nancy and Hannah's relationship from the revised books. I feel like, you know, Hannah was just there to give Nancy advice, and they just had these very, like, almost like daughter and mother type moments, or granddaughter and grandmother type moments. Like, I miss that relationship. Another weird thing about Nancy and Hannah's relationship in the original texts, it's very much like Hannah is a servant and Nancy is the employer, because in this next part, Hannah asks Nancy for permission to go to a moving picture show with her sister. So it's just kind of weird to see someone in their 40s or 50s, I presume, asking for permission to do something of a 16-year-old. So Hannah goes to the movies, and Nancy's left alone at the house, and she feels like someone is watching her. And this was really creepy, the way that Mildred Wirt Benson wrote this. But Nancy then finds a note on the doorstep that says, "Be warned in time, keep away from the Turnbull house." And Nancy believes it was written by a man. And the book really doesn't go into any detail on that. I don't know. It's not like she says, oh, it was an untidy scrawl, or it was written like with like someone bearing down really hard. It doesn't really say why she thinks a man wrote it, but that's what Nancy apparently thinks. So Nancy packs the revolver and some ammunition with her clothes and other items to go to the mansion, which I still can't get over the fact that Carson was just like, here, Nancy, get your gun. But Nancy goes to the mansion, and Rosemary says her sister, Floretta, has been worked up and is sick in bed. So these hauntings, quote unquote, are really starting to affect Rosemary and Floretta mentally. Like, that's got to be scary to feel like you're being terrorized within your own home. But Rosemary tells Nancy that they'll all lock their bedroom doors at night. And this, just like the suspense was just, it was very palpable. But the mansion also has no electricity, which is an interesting detail. So it's candles or nothing, which is really spooky. So Nancy decides that she's going to start looking for hidden passageways, because she's like, there's got to be an explanation for all these weird noises. Like, maybe there's, you know, some kind of passageway in the walls. So Rosemary mentions they have a built-in couch, which is really weird. Like, I've heard of built-in bookcases or something, but a built-in couch. So I think Nancy kind of just files that away in her brain. And me, as I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is going to come back to be very important, because nobody would make a built-in couch. Like, that's the most impractical piece of furniture. Like, no matter how threadbare and ugly this thing is, nobody's getting it out of here because it's built into the wall. So it's during the night that Nancy hears a yell and a thud, and she pulls the covers up as though by doing so she could protect herself from an unseen danger. And I was like, this is so me. Like, if I ever get scared of things, I'm always like, I'll just hide under the covers. No one will know that I'm here. But Nancy does eventually get up to investigate, and she forgets that she locked her door. So there's this moment of panic, like, I can't get out. Someone's locked me in. And it's like, no, Nancy, you locked yourself in because that's what you guys agreed you were going to do. So Floretta, ever the drama queen, she like cries out, and she says that she hopes Rosemary hasn't been murdered. I was like, dang. Okay, like, jump to conclusions, why don't you? But Nancy and Floretta discover that Rosemary's fine. She's just freaked out naturally. And so then Nancy leads the way through the house with the gun. So she's got the revolver, and then she's got these two older women behind her. And they're just checking everything out, and they don't see anything. But while we're on the subject of Rosemary and Floretta being older women, their age, so this is kind of crazy, but the book, the revised and the original, always made the sisters out to be spinsters, but the original text says they are nearly 30 years older than Nancy. So Nancy's 16, so that would make them around 46. I was like, that's not that old. That's not what I would classify as a spinster. I guess it's just the fact that they're not married and they live together. Just, I don't know. It's so interesting to me because I feel like in some ways how we look at age has changed a little bit in almost 100 years, but then in some ways it hasn't changed at all. So while Nancy, Rosemary, and Floretta don't find any suspects in the house, they do discover that a silver urn is missing and there's a ladder against a bookshelf in the library. So somebody was in there, they took this silver urn. That's not good. It would just be so creepy to me to know, like, somebody's been in my house, somebody took something, they've moved something. Like, you would probably, like they do in the revised text, you know, they get accused of being crazy, or they start to doubt their own mental capacities. Like, that would just be awful. The next note that I took down, Nancy starts to worry when she hasn't heard from Carson in a while because he went up to Chicago to work on another case. And so she sends a telegram and she learns that he left Chicago 2 days ago, but why hasn't he contacted her? So his plan had been to come to the mansion to help Nancy with the mystery if she needed his help. So Nancy is kind of alarmed about that, but while she's out, she also notices that there's a house not far from the Turnbulls that looks almost identical. So I feel like in the revised text, it was led on a little bit earlier, like, oh, there's a house over there that looks just like this one. But we don't get this detail till later in the book. So when Nancy gets back to the mansion, Floretta's dresses have been stolen out of her closet, and there are 2 canaries loose in her room, and so she gets really upset about this because she says it's a bad omen. I think this mostly has to do with mining culture, like miners, you know, we used to have canaries, but I would think that it would be not such a bad omen if the birds are alive. I mean, if they're dead, that's one thing, but I don't know. I just thought that was weird. I mean, it's probably just generally disconcerting to find birds in your house when they're not supposed to be there. So the next note that I wrote down, Nancy finally hits on a clue because we're a little bit deeper into this mystery when she starts finding these clues. But according to Rosemary and Floretta, Nathan Gombet was interested in buying their house. So now she starts to wonder if he's been trying to chase them off. So next up, Carson's point of view is taken up in the book, and it says he sent Nancy a telegram, but it was intercepted. But he gets a so-called reply back from her saying she'll pick him up at the station. So this is how that whole situation gets exploited. Nancy sent a telegram to her dad. She finds out he left 2 days ago, and then Carson thinks he's been replying to Nancy this whole time, but it's actually someone else. So this next part is really messed up, but Nathan Gombet shows up to the train station, and he tells Carson that Nancy has been in a car wreck. And so, of course, Carson is beside himself and just so worried about Nancy. And I don't think they did this in the revised. I'm not 100% positive, but I think Carson just was expecting to be picked up by someone else, and then he ended up shoved into this taxi and then drugged. But like that's really messed up of Nathan Gombet to do that, to lie to Carson and say that Nancy is hurt. So Nathan Gombet takes Carson prisoner at the identical mansion next to the Turnbulls, and he actually turns a gun on Carson. He's threatening him to sign these papers and basically to pay him because he feels like he didn't get paid enough for that parcel of land that he sold on his own before to that railroad company. It's it's messed up. Of course, Carson refuses. He's like, I'm not going to do that. And so Nathan Gombet is just like, well, I'll just starve it out of you. So this next note kind of got me. I was just like, why did these women not give Nancy all the details at the beginning of this mystery? But Floretta and Rosemary are not the best at drawing conclusions. They forgot to mention Nathan Gombet wanted to buy their house, and then they forgot to mention that he lives literally next door in an identical house to theirs, and the fact that he owns canaries. Like, do you guys not see the relevance of any of that? There's a reason why Nancy gets hired for these cases, because some people just don't, like, even if a clue hits them in the face, they just don't see it. And maybe that's unfair of me to say because I'm the reader and of course I see all these clues and I see all the dots that connect, but like, I don't know, maybe I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe Floretta and Rosemary were more willing to believe that their house was haunted rather than to believe that somebody would be capable of doing that to them, because that's pretty bad to think that somebody would take advantage of you like that or do something like that. That would be a hard pill to swallow. So we've now arrived to the part of this book where Nathan Gombet's maid is mentioned, and it's not a very good depiction, but he has a servant who is referred to as being colored. We get worse descriptions than that in this book, but just reading that alone, I was like, ugh. So the next note that I took down, the story of the two houses goes like this. They were owned by two brothers during the Civil War. One supported the Union and the other supported the Confederacy. And I honestly liked this story more than what they said in the Revised. In the Revised, they just said, oh, it was two brothers during the Revolutionary War. And this made more sense to me because, I mean, living in East Tennessee, where I'm from, it was pretty evenly split between Union and Confederate support, so this was a much more believable story to me. I'm also trying to picture a house from the Revolutionary War still standing, because if there's one thing that's true about America, like a lot of houses, they're not still standing unless they're like of historic importance, and this house, you know, the mansion and the house that looks like it, don't really strike me as houses of historical importance. And I mean, even, 1930 to, the 1770s or so, like, that's not as far of a gap as now, but it's just harder for me to picture it. It also might lend some credence to the passageways that are underneath the houses and connect. Like, we can speculate all we want on what those were used for. The book doesn't really say or go into detail, but in the revised text, I don't know, it just says that they were two brothers and then they fought, or they made up, I guess, at some point. But this just makes more sense because the Civil War, I mean, it split families apart. So next, Nancy sneaks over to Nathan Gombet's house, and she sees him sneak out into the night. And it's at this point when Nancy decides she's going to climb in the cellar window, and there's this really suspenseful scene where Nancy hides and the maid investigates the sound that the window made. This whole scene was really, really tense because Nancy ends up hiding again in the pantry and the kitchen, and then she ends up hiding in this room upstairs, which is really, really freaky because it's full of taxidermy and real birds. And then this parrot starts squawking, so Nancy has to hide because it draws attention, and so the maid comes and investigates again. So Nancy ends up hiding in this closet in that room, and then when the maid leaves again, Nancy tries the door and it's locked, so she's locked in there. So having nothing better to do, Nancy goes back in the closet in the creepy bird room, and she finds a passageway because there's a false back. The wall opens up, and she falls down a flight of steps, and she gets knocked out. She hits her head so hard that she knocks out, and when she comes to, she follows the passageway and sees that it leads her back to the Turnbull mansion. So this is why Nathan Gombet wants the houses, because they connect and he can do, I don't know, illegal, nefarious activities. Like, they don't really explain this. I don't know if they do in the revised either, but it's just like, he's a bad guy, so he's going to use it for bad things. Like, that's all we get. So Nancy ends up showing Floretta and Rosemary the passageway, and together they go to the sheriff, and not a moment too soon, because Nathan Gombet asked to buy the house again, and the sisters accepted. But luckily they didn't sign anything, so they're not locked into it. Meanwhile, though, and this is crazy, the whole time Carson is upstairs in the house. Like, Nancy was so close to him when she was in that room with all the taxidermy birds, and she didn't hear him because he's probably weak. He hasn't had any food. He's been abused by Nathan Gombet. But it's so crazy that they were that close to each other and didn't know. So this next note's kind of funny, but when they go to the sheriff, Nancy gets frustrated with the sheriff for quote-unquote dragging his feet, and she says her father could convince him, and he asks who that is. And when Nancy says Carson Drew, the sheriff says, "Why didn't you say so?" And Nancy says, "What does that have to do with the case?" I love that Nancy addressed this and said this because it seems like in the revised books, Nancy will just go to the police and they just jump. Whenever she says jump, they do. So they all go back to Nathan Gombet's house, and Nancy is frustrated and tells the sheriff he shouldn't have just roared up to the house, because the book says that Nancy kind of just took her time and slowly drove in. I mean, you can still hear a car, it's probably a gravel driveway, but apparently the sheriff just roars in with his lights going and stuff, and so she's frustrated with him. But they sneak in the cellar window again, and they come face to face with Nathan's maid, and she's got a shotgun. That would be pretty scary to be looking down the barrel of a gun, but Nathan's maid says, "You get out of here, white man, or I'll fill your system full of lead." I was like, okay, she is not playing. So she slams the door to the cellar in their face, and so they're basically just standing there at a stalemate. They're like, we can't go into the kitchen because she's got a gun. And so Nancy decides to take the sheriff over to the Turnbull's house, and they go through the passageway so they can sneak up on the maid and arrest her. So remember that weird couch that's just built into the mansion? So that's where the passageway begins, and so that's where Nancy takes the sheriff down through the passageway to get over to Nathan Gombet's house. And it's when they do that they find Nathan Gombet and arrest him, and then Nancy is reunited with Carson. So it's kind of funny, but the Turnbull sisters actually let Nancy keep their silver urn. That's the reward she gets for solving this case. And I couldn't remember if she got any kind of, memento of solving the case in the revised book. She really doesn't. They say they're going to make her lunch. That's her reward for solving the mystery. And the last note that I took down, Carson says he's going to hand over his cases to Nancy from now on. So I don't really have a What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen segment for this episode. There was not much specific mentioning of food in the book. It would say they ate a meal, but it really didn't go into specifics. So now let's talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the Hidden Staircase original text. The things that I liked, I actually liked the spooky bird room. That was really creepy, and I just think that would have been cooler in the revised book. There were a lot of just creepy moments in this book where Nancy almost gets caught. And I like that Nathan Gombet didn't talk about himself in third person, and he was honestly a horrible villain. I really did not like him. And another thing I liked, there's no Dirk the tennis champion in the original text. He's in the revised, and I just didn't like that whole dynamic where it was Carson was like, oh, Dirk, he doesn't like to be kept waiting and all this stuff. And he just seemed like a weird character to just throw in there. So I don't know, just from reading the past few original texts, I feel like Harriet just threw in these love interests for Nancy, and then they just disappear until we get to Ned Nickerson, of course. So the things I didn't like about this original text, I said, even though Helen's apparently a gossip, I kind of missed her. I missed the funny scenes that we had in the revised for this book. I feel like Helen would have helped Nancy quite a bit if she'd been involved in the case in any sort of way. But I also didn't like some of the depictions of Nathan Gombet's maid. I left some of these things out, but they kind of just made her to be sort of dumb, or the way they described her was not at all complimentary. Which I get it, we're not supposed to like villains or think that they're particularly smart at all times, but it could have been more tastefully done, I guess. So the rating that I gave the revised text was 3 magnifying glasses, and after reading the original text for the Hidden Staircase, I would give it 4 magnifying glasses. Even despite some of the things I didn't like, some of that insensitivity or Helen not being a big part of the book, I feel like overall the original text was a better book. But as far as which book did I like better? I kind of favor the revised, but only if they had kept the creepy stuff in. Like, I wish we could have still gotten the funny scenes with Helen, but then also the creepy bird room and some of those aspects of the original text. So yeah, that kind of concludes today's episode on the original text of The Hidden Staircase. For next week's episode, we're going to discuss the original text of The Bungalow Mystery. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.